Well, welcome back. I hope you survived cardiac arrest from the first session or whatever other trauma it may have introduced. Appreciate you rejoining us for what hopefully will be the useful part of these briefings we call the Vortex strategy. And the real question as we stand here is the puzzlement, because anyone that presumes that the coming 12 to 24 months are going to be smooth sailing just hasn't done their homework. Now, whether it'll be up or down, who knows? The turbulence can come from the financial sector, which is over-leveraged. It can come from missteps in political estimates. It can come from nuclear deterrence in the Middle East. Who knows? Clearly, the likelihood of it being smooth sailing is very, very low. So we don't know whether it's going to go up or down. And for that reason, we call our response to this situation the Vortex strategy. And this session will attempt to deal with our action plan in response to that. Again, twice in the book of Proverbs, 22:3 and also 27:12, it says, "A prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished indeed." So the Vortex strategy. You see, our times are uniquely uncertain. There are times when you worry about a precipice of some kind, indeed. There's other times you're worried about inflation. It's rare that you have both threats coming at you with intense uncertainty. It's impossible to predict. Anyone that thinks they can predict is probably hasn't done the full homework. It could be hyperinflation, not just inflation. That's one thing. Hyperinflation is one possibility. The other possibility is a depression. Both have their collection of experts that have their reasons for embracing those projections. And setting both of those aside, it could be just some logistic upheavals of something going wrong in some of these large-scale plans that are being set, either in the military or economically or internationally. So what's the optimum strategy if you're a military leader and you have uncertainty? You know, the history is full of examples where you don't rely on the Maginot Line, you don't rely on fortifications. The military strategy under conditions of uncertainty is always mobility. That's why tanks are so powerful instead of fixed emplacements and so on. And mobility is always the response to uncertainty. Now, in financial terms, the equivalent of that is liquidity. The important thing for each of us to do in facing the uncertainties we face is to be liquid, be flexible, be able to shift and zig and zag if you need to zig and zag. So we have 4 points, and they are perhaps disarmingly simple. The first step we're going to suggest is to lower your cost of living. All of us operate on the presumption that next year will be better than last year, and so we always tend to presume on the future. No, we got to do the opposite. You want to lower your cost of living. How do you do that? We'll talk about that. Once you lower your cost of living, your next attack is on your debt. You want to get out of debt, and we'll explain why as we go. Once you do get out of debt, your next challenge, which is a different one, is to guard your liquidity. Understand what can attack that. And finally, the most important factor of all, and we'll deal with that when we get there. So let's take these one at a time. The first one is to lower your cost of living. And what that really means is you don't want to count on an increase in your income. All of us expect to get a merit raise, maybe this, maybe that, whatever. Maybe Aunt Harriet will pass away and leave you a stipend or whatever. No. Don't count on increases in your income. If they should occur, that'll just give you more margin. We're going to suggest you aggressively do just the opposite. Take your income, whatever it is, and I strongly suspect that if you take your expenses today, they're probably a little larger than your income. That's where credit cards come in or whatever else, okay? So the first step is not an easy one, but it's the most critical one in your life. Your life depends on it, and that is reduce your expenses. Adopt with rigor a lower cost of living. Why do I say that? Well, for several reasons, not the least of which is that same income then will leave something that's yours to keep. So you want to reduce your cost of living so that you have some discretionary funds with which to pursue your strategy, whatever it is. It's that simple. Now, how do you go about doing that? It sounds simple. Let me back up a little bit here. One of the ways you deal with this is, of course, to make a budget of your time. Where do you spend your time? Not your dollars, your time. And take a look at what's really important to you from your time. You'll probably discover that there are indulgences that you allow yourself that you really don't have the time to do. Find things that you can do without. Budget your time. Let that determine those, make some priorities in your life that are the most important ones, and build a budget to meet those and get rid of the surpluses. Simplify. Get back to basics. Okay, so you want to get out of debt. See, debt is a presumption on the future. And we certainly can't presume on the future today. Debt is contrary to God's plan for your life. The scripture clearly says the borrower is slave to the lender. That's, again, Proverbs 22:7. The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Believe it. God would have you free of that kind of bondage. And I'll show you why in a minute. So what you're going to do is use the increments that you gain from step one to repair the following. To refinance variable rate mortgages. If you're in a variable rate mortgage, fix that. You do not want to be in a variable rate mortgage under the kind of conditions that we may be plunging into. Fixed rate mortgage. If you have one, find a way, negotiate your way out of that one. Desperately. You need to eliminate credit card debt. It's terribly, terribly expensive, and that will swallow you up. You need to systematically, aggressively eliminate the credit card debt. What I want you to do is establish and control a serious budget as if your life depended on it. You know why? Because it does. Your degrees of freedom as an individual, your stewardship as the head of a family, demands that you take these steps to give you as much flexibility as is attainable in the months ahead. Okay, so let's assume you've done that. You've managed to tighten the belt. You've gotten rid of a few indulgences, what have you. You've been able to get your debts under control. You now have, amazingly enough, some surplus, some liquidity. What do you do with that? Your next step is to guard it jealously. You don't go for earnings, you go for liquidity. So once your debt is under control, you can now use that margin from step one to establish your reserves. What you're going to do with those is diversify them in different asset classes. I'm not suggesting you're diversified because you own different stocks. No, no, no. Stocks, bonds, there's about 7 major categories of investment. Diversify. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. What you want to do is diversify those asset classes, but you want to do it in a way that maintains your liquidity. With a click of a mouse, you can shift from A to B to C. That's possible today. That's one reason real estate is such a heavy kind of investment, because it's very illiquid. You can never sell it when you want to. Now, the investment in your house is more than just an investment. That's a whole emotional thing altogether. But you want to get it into investments that you can get out of. Most projects are easier to get into than out of. But as you pick your targets, maintain liquidity. Don't worry about maximizing earnings, not for the next few years. Let's get through the storm, conserving what you got. What you want to do is you want to straddle industries, straddle borders, straddle currencies. That's all feasible to do if you do it under good advice. The other step in guarding your liquidity may surprise you, and that's to get your assets out of reach from your adversaries. And what am I talking about that? Well, first of all, in order to do that, you need to know who they are. And secondly, you need to take precautionary steps before they're needed. Once you need them, it may be too late, and I'll explain what I mean. In guarding your assets, asset protection, you need to understand that we live in a litigious society. Anyone can sue anyone else. I understand there's a lawsuit filed every 10 seconds by someone against somebody else. Now, the problem that you're going to have, especially in troubled times, is a large reservoir of underemployed attorneys. And one of the things they can do is they can go down shareholder lists of public companies. They can go to the Hall of Records and find out who has a large piece of property that has no encumbrances. They can contrive a grievance against one of those. If they can do it as a class action, there's no countersuit possible. There's all kind. You're suddenly entering the world of games, of special rules, that's won by people who know those rules. Anyone can sue anyone, and every lawsuit is a roulette wheel. Ask any competent attorney, and they will tell you if you really have the facts on your side, you've got a 50-50 chance of maybe winning. That may shock you. Many people find themselves in court with something they consider totally without merit and discover it's going to cost them a lot to defend themselves, and they do have the jeopardy of having what's called in the trade an unworthy judgment. Protecting yourself against the unworthy judgment is something that anyone with assets needs to anticipate. Once you're confronted with such a situation, it's too late to do much because that can be contrived as a contrivance. And so every lawsuit is a roulette wheel. So what I'm suggesting you'll want to do if you get this far in your program is to protect yourself in advance against the so-called unworthy judgment. That's one reason if you have a piece of property, real estate property, it's probably be well advised to have it significantly encumbered. Because if it's clear, it's a target for someone to contrive an action. If it's large enough and there's a possibility, there are people that will have time on their hands and the skills to play this game. So what do you do about that? Your ultimate defense against this kind of an action is to own nothing. When that guy shows up on your doorstep with a court judgment that you owe him $10 million, you say, great, here's my wristwatch, that's all I own. I own nothing. Take it. Take nothing. I own nothing. What do you mean? You've got a laptop, you've got a car. No, those are leased from the company. They're not mine. They belong to XYZ. You follow me? So this whole ultimate defense is own nothing. And where this plunges us into the use of trusts, corporations, foundations, what have you. Now, trusts come from, its origin is English common law. They are very powerful tools. They don't necessarily require registration. They can be surprisingly invisible. We're talking about testamentary trusts and inter vivos living trusts, both revocable and irrevocable. And what are the advantages? Well, first of all, if you have assets of some kind, it speeds up their distribution instead of probate. You don't want to have your assets passed to your beneficiaries through probate. Trust me. That's another roulette wheel you don't need right now, and it's a very expensive one. Trusts are more difficult to contest. If you've got people in the weeds that are upset with it, they'll have a tougher time fighting that battle. They're far more private than a will. They can be very invisible if you so want them that way. Now, since we're talking in general of revocable trusts, once you make them, you can change them anytime you like. You suddenly change your mind. You can change beneficiaries. You can change terms and conditions. They are revocable. You can change them when you like. There are reasons occasionally to make them irrevocable. That can have enormous power for certain purposes. Two primarily. One is taxation, and the second is access to creditors. Creditors can't get at them if it's done properly. So you can make most of your financial value out of reach, and that's what we're talking about here. The other advantage of trust, it avoids the time and expense of probate. It's a much more efficient, less expensive procedure. What are the disadvantages? Well, they're not free. It costs a few $100s to form one, and if they're complicated, a few $1,000s maybe. Most attorneys can, that's what they specialize in. You want to get one that knows what he's doing, and it's not free, but it's not prohibitive, and depending on how complex you want to make it. They do require administration and expense, but again, that's modest. It might be an hour or two of time per year with your attorney to make sure it's current and you want to make some changes. One of the problems with a trust is it can be mismanaged because you have a problem of successor trustees. If something happens to you, who's going to be the trustee? It could be some person you trust, but you might trust them now, you might trust them later, or they might have an accident. So that there is an advantage to having an institutional trustee of some kind. And that there are issues there that your advisor can deal with there. But there are conditions, both tax and creditor conditions, that suggest an irrevocable trust. In other words, making it such that you can't get at it yourself, that there's an advantage to doing that sometimes. And there are ways you can do that, especially with offshore trusts where your trustee is offshore, but he'll follow your wishes, but you don't have direct control. And that you really do, but you don't, and there's an advantage in that kind of thing. Now, what are the action steps? Well, you have to create the trust. Your trustors and trustees, that is the creator of the trust and the manager of the trust, are usually the same person while he's living at least. There is the issue of successor trustees, which can be individuals or institutions. You have to designate beneficiaries, and they're changeable presumably. But the key thing in the whole process here is to transfer your assets clearly out of your name into the name of your name as a trustee. And you need to do that very, very carefully and very, very skillfully. They have to be carefully drafted. The title documents to what you're transferring have to be done precisely correctly. That's why you want to have a competent attorney do that to make this effective. It also needs to be done, presumably, usually, a year in advance of needing it. In other words, if you do this 30 days before getting hit with a or after you get hit with a lawsuit, it won't fly because it'll be considered a contrivance, a fraudulent conveyance, they will call it. If it's done a year ago, one can normally argue that you had no anticipation of a suit being filed, or it wasn't done because of the suit being filed, and so you can enjoy that protection. But the smart time to do this is do it right now before you have any apparent need of it. So create the trust, then hope a year goes by before someone decides to sue you. That's basically the strategy. You need to avoid any appearance of fraudulent conveyance to avoid creditors. You don't want to create the impression that that's the only reason you're doing this. And there's plenty of good reasons and good benefit in creating a trust anyway. The benefit that you may be most concerned about getting of a list of 10 will be the creditor issue. But trusts are also very powerful tools for estate planning. There are AB trusts, ABC trusts, Q-tip trusts, and it's not my purpose here to go through the subtleties other than to say multiple trusts can be structured in such a way as to maximize your advantages under current estate laws. And so there's huge, huge benefit in having a competent person review your situation and do some meaningful estate planning that will mix the different kinds of trusts and maybe with insurance here and there to maximize your entire estate situation today, not just after you pass away. And this is also where irrevocable trusts start to come into the picture. There are places for them. Wealth preservation trusts. They're a tax-free environment for highly appreciated assets, especially if you have a highly appreciated asset of some kind, a hotel that you paid $10 for, it's now worth $10 million. You don't want to own that. You want that in a properly constructed trust if you want to really maximize your benefit of it. Whatever. You also want to be aware of the fact that if you're giving donations and you have a choice of cash or appreciated assets, tax-wise, you are much better off donating highly appreciated assets than cash itself. So your advisors can explain that all to you. But anyway, if you do, and again, with irrevocable trusts, if you create them early enough in advance, they can protect you from creditors, and yet you can protect yourself against the creditor and not deny yourself the use of it. Your house could belong in an irrevocable trust. You can live in it. Your creditors can't touch the house. And so you need to understand that. There is a category here you also want to be aware of, and that's what's called a charitable remainder trust. One of the most powerful tools in estate planning and relatively rarely used because most people don't understand them. And you can get very significant immediate benefits as well as continuing tax benefits by considering this. How it works is the use of the assets, you retain the use of the assets until the death of the owner and or the spouse. And the remaining, whatever assets remain at the death of both the person and the spouse, say, can then go to a designated charity. Now the advantage is you can get the deduction for all this up front. You can continue to use the assets, like say a home or an income-producing piece of property, during your lifetime and the lifetime of you and your spouse. But when that's all over, the remaining assets, or a portion thereof, can be donated to a charity of your choice, whatever you would tend to favor. And all of these strategies can be supplemented with life insurance. There are very, very interesting places that a life insurance policy can fit and plug a hole and so forth. So that, again, there's a huge, huge opportunity here for a competent advisor to guide you. But as you do all of this, there's another dimension I want you to do a little homework and consider. Some of these trusts can also be offshore. If you're really paranoid about a lot of things, there is an entire industry offshore to create these trusts outside the United States. That creates additional barriers for someone that's on the attack. That's why there's a place called Liechtenstein or Switzerland or even Austria and other places that have laws that are uniquely designed to protect trusts, but their invisibility and their proper execution. Again, it costs money and takes some homework, so it's just an area to be aware of. They're private, they're very sound, but they can be expensive. Another thing to consider is international bank accounts. You'll be amazed to discover how different an international bank is compared to the banks within the U.S. And there are rules for U.S. banks that are very restrictive. Outside the U.S., the banks can be very, very powerful partners. They can avoid disclosure. There is an issue of accessibility you have to consider, but there's a whole world of bank accounts you might want to consider. Something that's overlooked by most people is foreign life insurance. The life insurance capital of the world is London, and the next runner-up is Switzerland. And the reason is that foreign life insurance is invisible. It's not like a bank account which has to be registered. A life insurance policy is a contract, so it can be totally invisible. It's not an account in the usual parlance. And the foreign life insurance can be a very, very powerful technique. Something else to recognize, it's very, very advisable to have a current passport. You never know what circumstances may occur. You want to have one current, and you want one for each member of your family separately. Don't have your kids in yours. Make them independently so there's independent possibilities. Simple to do, takes a little homework, do it. Have a separate one for each member of the family. Now, there's a lot of other things we could be talking about, other forms of ownership. In corporations, I happen to favor corporations over partnerships for a number of reasons. They're simple, they can be private, they can be invisible, they can even be bearer stock. There's all kinds of ways to use these. They're very simple, and there are jurisdictions that specialize in these things. There are tax considerations. Usually a corporation's negative is that you get double tax, but with sub-S, C-Corp, and LLCs and other forms of that, you can get around the tax problems very easily. So corporations are simple because they're all understandable. Who owns what, who's who. Now, there are very powerful techniques in the forms of limited partnerships. And many of the most sophisticated things I've been in are limited partnerships. The problem with them, from my point of view, is that they require continuing legal supervision. You can't turn around without having your attorney amend the articles, or it takes a continual dialogue with the attorneys. With the corporation, you need an attorney when you form it, when you close it down, and in between, things are usually simple enough you can just do it by having a well-documented meeting. So I prefer corporations for most of the shenanigans I get into. But limited partnerships are appropriate if you're going to have legal counsel involved anyway. There are powerful techniques there that you can get advice. But the main point I'm going to suggest you seriously consider is have a plan. Have a plan. Do your own homework, reading, and do your background study on these things. And use an attorney that's experienced in what you're pursuing, either asset protection or taxation are specialty areas. You want to use an attorney, not an accountant, because the attorney is you are protected with the attorney-client privilege. If you have an accountant in the picture, fine, make sure he's working for your attorney, because that way the attorney protection can prevail over your accountant too. An accountant, when you think of an accountant, the tax people say that an accountant is a snitch. He's required to report whatever the IRS wants to know. An attorney has attorney-client privilege. If the accountant's working for the attorney in your situation, he's protected under the attorney-client privilege. So, small point, but be aware of it. But the main thing is have a plan, do your own homework, be diligent, especially in its continuous maintenance. That's one place in my past. I've been 30 years doing these kinds of things. I have to be candid with you. Many times I start off great, I put the pieces in place, and then I don't follow up. A year or two or three, they quickly get out of date. They're often just paper tigers on the shelf for emergencies, and you end up collapsing for failure of my diligence. So they do require continuous maintenance. There are a number of other topics that we'll be addressing in subsequent editions. You need to address your spiritual portfolio. What do I mean by that? Your personal portfolio, your armory. That really involves doing a serious study of the 7 elements of spiritual armor that are detailed in Ephesians 6. And this is one of the things that should be an appropriate appendix to this briefing. You want to take seriously your priesthood of the family. As we move into these uncertain times, that may be one of the most important challenges before you, is to repair any deficiencies in that regard. I'm going to encourage everyone. In the 60 years that I've been an active Christian, the one place, virtually the only place I can think of offhand, where people really grow is in small group studies. Small enough groups so they can ask questions without embarrassment, that meet frequently enough, there's a sense of accountability among them. That's where people really grow. And so I encourage you to consider being involved in a small group, whether it's a house church or just a group of businessmen meeting Thursday morning breakfasts or whatever form is comfortable, but be involved in a small group whose primary role is the exposition of the Scriptures. There may be social reasons, there may be a potluck dinner involved, that's all great, but make sure you preserve, with the number one priority, time spent in a systematic verse-by-verse study of the Bible itself, not somebody's book that's popular at the moment, that sort of thing. That's all fine and good. No, we're talking about expositional study of the Word. God will bless that. And so another area that you might give some serious consideration, if we have the kinds of disruption that may occur, there is a value in doing some preparation and self-sufficiency. If you happen to have the blessing of being away from a metropolitan area in a semi-rural community where there's a large culture of food-growing industries and where most of the residents themselves are armed, that's an advantage in contrast to being dependent upon the metropolitan services of a large city. If we get into those kinds of times, you might give some serious thought and prayer to those issues. And you ought to also maintain careful surveillance of your health and the maintenance thereof. Most of us go to the doctor when we're sick rather than have a systematic program of annual checkups and do a little bit of homework in that area. Another area, as we look at the turbulent times we're facing, is the discoveries that many people have yet to make about the benefits of homeschooling. It is astonishing to look at the statistics. It's astonishing to see the leadership that emerges from the homeschooling environment in contrast to the government schools, which are deliberately designed to dumb down the population. That sounds shocking. I hope it does, so that you'll do some homework and challenge that assertion. The homeschooling world is an industry that's well supported with creative materials. The product of the homeschooling environment is well recognized by the major universities. The Harvards and Stanfords of this world will prefer that product compared to the general output of the public system. And it's a poorly kept secret, but very widely recognized. The other thing I'm going to include in my list of ancillary topics here is to exploit the new technologies that are available to the serious Christian. I'm talking about podcasting. I'm talking about software for your computer to study the Bible. I'm also talking about online memberships. And I'll close, when I close, I'll give you some thoughts about our institute. But I've left the most important topic of all. We've talked about 3 of the 4 major topics that I call the Vortex strategy. The 4th one is the most important of all. Learn the supernatural basis of stewardship. And that's a whole other study. Because this is the solution to all financial problems. God commits himself to that. Man's purposes for, what are your purposes for money? Well, most of it would list 3 things. To provide for security, establish independence, create power and influence. That sounds pretty good. That's pretty typical of the advice that a young father would give to his graduating son or what have you. Those are the 3 targets. That's man's view. Let's contrast that with God. Man's focus is power and position. God's way is submission. Whoops, a little different. What's the emphasis? Man's emphasis is on rights and freedoms. God's way is personal responsibility. Man's desire is to gain for self, and God's way is to meet the needs of others. Man's concern is, of course, immediate fulfillment. God's way is lasting achievement. Do you see a divergence here? A little different perspective. Man's yearning is for the praise of men. We don't like to admit it, but it's certainly true. God's way is the approval of God. Man's aspiration is to be served. God's way is to serve others. Man's need is to push ahead. God's way is for patience. Man's striving is to lead men. God's way is to follow God. Man's interest is for competition. God's way is cooperation. Man's motivation is to self-glorification, and of course, God's motivation is God's glory. You can make many different lists like this, but clearly as we try to put ourselves in God's perspective, we get quite a different perspective of life itself. What are God's purposes for money? Well, the first one is provision. Second, direction. Third is fellowship, believe it or not. And fourth is demonstration. And they have their Old Testament references, but let's take each one in. The first one, provision, to provide basic needs. Oliver Discourse talks about that. Partly to establish dependence on Him daily. That's one of God's purposes. Not for us to be independent, but rather to recognize our dependence on Him. And furthermore, to deepen our love for the Lord. He should accompany you step by step, day by day. To develop a spirit of gratefulness. Boy, how precious that is. To teach us to live within our means. That's a tough one, but a real one. And to help us to enjoy our possessions. It's interesting how often the pursuit of those possessions interferes with our real enjoyment of those possessions. How often? I know in our life there have been indulgences that really get in the way of enjoyment. The maintenance turns out to be not worth the trouble. Second one is to confirm direction. This is one where God gives us direction. To build our faith and vision. To really determine who is the Lord of our life. And who's really running things. Who's in charge here. Another purpose God has for money is to protect us from harmful items. How often, if we had the means, we might dig ourselves a deep hole. I usually say the first law of holes is to stop digging. And, of course, to teach us patience. How impatient we are. We're always in a hurry. I'm always reminded of a sermon that Chuck Smith preached one day about, have you ever thanked God for the prayers He didn't answer? An interesting question. He says the time that he's reminded of that, especially when he hits his high school reunions and he meets the gals that he couldn't live without back then. And he praises God that God didn't answer his prayer. Anyway, to concentrate on true riches, God's perspective will draw us to focus in the right direction. The third thing is to give to other Christians. That is a very legitimate, appropriate ambition for us to garner and steward our wealth. To be able to be in a position to help other Christians. To unite them. To demonstrate the mark of a Christian ourselves. To initiate spontaneous thanksgiving. To multiply the potential for giving. That's God's purposes for money. And finally, to illustrate God's power. To cause Christians to trust Him. God uses that. In fact, one of my personally most important insights in life was to realize that every day God finds another way to ask the question, do you trust me? And is there any more powerful way that He does that than in our financial affairs? Do you trust Him? And that's what His goal is, to have us trust Him. And to mock the false gods of our age. That's one of the things He does. He'll provide in ways that makes it very clear it wasn't your skill or shrewdness, it was His grace that causes that particular check to arrive at just the right time because He has His fingerprints all over it. Another purpose that God has for money is to purify our lives and motives, to really focus ourselves on the basics, on the essentials. Another thing is to bring non-Christians to salvation. That's a valuable use of resources. And of course, ultimately, finally, to glorify God. That's the long and the short of it. Well, another subject that comes up in this whole area is tithing. We're going to try to talk about the key areas here. God does a very peculiar thing in Malachi chapter 3. It's very, even Jesus makes reference to the fact that we are not to test God. The general rule, and Jesus Himself alludes to it, that we're not there to put God to the test. That's like daring God. There is one exception in the Scripture. It's Malachi 3, where the Creator of the universe Himself puts Himself in a box. He gives you a dare to put Him to the test, to dare Him, and see if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing so that will not be room enough to receive it. He makes that commitment to the tither. And it's very strange that God would put Himself in that tight a box. But there it is in Malachi 3. And I want you to notice this issue of many of us associate tithing, well, that's an Old Testament thing. No, 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 no. That's not. That was instituted before the law. The law was given in Exodus 20. In Genesis 14, we have the tithes emerge. For 4 reasons we have tithes. It acknowledges the rights of the Creator. 1/10 of everything is His, just by decree. He made the place, He makes the rules. And He regards the first 10th of anything His in the first place. So when you give Him a 10th, you're just returning that which is already His. You need to understand that. Tithing is also the antidote for greed and covetousness, interestingly enough. It disconnects us from that passion, that path. It's a test of our faith. Do you really believe God? Do you believe Malachi 3:10 and all that? The other thing you'll discover, but you need to discover so, not because I said so. No, 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 no. You have to find out for yourself. But you'll discover that it is indeed the solution to every financial problem. God's resources are not limited, and He's there for you if you are being responsive to Him. And He loves to show off in that regard. He loves to do it in a way that becomes clearly Him and not your own cleverness or what have you. Now, the Old Testament pattern of tithing, we hardly have to document, but it's all through the Torah, all through the Old Testament, obviously. New Testament confirms it, however. Christ does not set aside tithes in Matthew 23, verse 23. It's implied by Paul in the even so of 1 Corinthians 9, 13 and 14. It's clear that it's taken for granted there. 1 Corinthians 16, lay by him store. All these things underscore the reality of the continuing tithes and offerings. So what's the difference between a tithe and offering? And by the way, Paul's allusions, of course, go to Malachi and so forth. Now, it's interesting that tithing is even more binding on the New Testament Christian than it is for the Old Testament believer. Why? Because of Luke 12:48. For unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required. It's more binding on us since our privileges are greater than the Old Testament believer. So 1/10 of everything is His in the first place. So what you want to do as part of the Vortex strategy is to be strict, be careful, and be systematic. Separate the funds upon arrival. Have a separate checking account just for His work or whatever. Keep records. Realize your giving only comes after the return of His 10th. So make that your practice. I want to highlight something else that may come as a surprise. I really didn't understand this during most of my Christian ministry. It wasn't until I got on some boards of directors of other ministries that I began to recognize an interesting procedure. I spent most of my time I spent a 30-year career on Wall Street, in a sense, in corporate, publicly traded corporate directorships and so on. And if you've been on Wall Street, you know that most of the major money, professional money, is in the hands of professional managers that manage portfolios. And they, to a fault, manage quarter to quarter. They manage each quarter, so at the end of the quarter, they'll look as good as they can be for that quarter. And now the Asians and the Europeans have a little different perspective. They have a little longer horizon, but still, every portfolio manager has a reporting period, and his whole conduct is such that he wants to get at the end of that reporting period looking back with a minimum of regret. And that's actually a key thing in decision theory. Minimizing their maximum regret is called the Savage principle in the mathematics of game theory and so forth. In other words, they want to minimize the maximum. What's the regret? What could have happened had it been different? I want to minimize whatever that would be called regret. I want to minimize the maximum regret. That turns out, as you mathematically model the decisions, it takes you a slightly different path than you might take otherwise. And so, but that turns out long run to be the right strategy. And that's what portfolio managers try to do. Well, from that background, I noticed that the really competent givers, sources of funds, do the same thing in a very different way. See, the professional manager makes his decisions in light of the ultimate review of the end of the reporting period. You and I want to do the same thing with our giving. We don't want to give to a ministry because of need. There are more needs that will ring your doorbell than you possibly can respond to. There's no shortage of needs around the globe, even within the Christian context. There are more needs than you can deal with. That doesn't turn out to be a very useful yardstick in and of itself. What you want to do is look for evidence that God is in the action and then join him in what he is doing. When I was very active as a professional director, I've served on 12 boards as chairman and CEO of 6 of those, but I spent a lot of time with investment groups, especially venture capitalists, because we were primarily in high-tech, high-risk ventures. I got a very interesting insight into one of the prominent venture capitalists that I was close friends with. They constantly see proposals, and they can never be sure that which ones are going to win, which ones are losers. That's part of the game, is you make some bets, you'll win a few, lose a few. You hope you make enough on the winners. You may have one winner in 20, but you win enough on that to pay for the other 19 kind of things. It's that kind of world. But it was interesting insight because this one particular guy, he pointed out, he was much more concerned that he didn't want to pass a project that turned out to be a big winner. He was more worried about that than if he invested in something and turned out to be a loser. And then I realized from that remark that, see, the whole thing is really, one of the insights is it's all ego. It's not return on investment. Because where it's a loser, they have ways of cutting the losses, and yet they want to be, the whole idea in venture capital was to be joining the guys who were on this particular winning project, whatever it might be. And so, in a sense, they're doing the same thing. They're really trying to guess which ones are going to prove to be the most meaningful investments. They're not worried about making an investment where it might not be as good. They're primarily concerned about being with a winning investment. Well, a winning investment in terms of your giving is to be supporting something that you know God is in. Because again, God doesn't need your money because he's going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. But he will extend to you the privilege of joining him in this project or that project. You want to make sure it's one of those and not just someone that is in a box canyon of some kind. So now, there's another thing. You can't take it with you. That's not true. That's not true. You can take it with you. Luke 16 tells you how. You see, it's just like if you're going to visit a foreign country, like especially a third world country or something, you don't wait till you get there to convert your money. You usually get your banker to do it. What you do is you convert your currency into the coin of the realm before you get to their airport, right? Well, you do the same thing going to heaven. You send up your resources ahead. You can't take it with you. You ship it on ahead. So in other words, what you want to do is use the resources God has provided to you here on earth for his work, and he'll take care of you on the other end. And you simply must send it, as I say, send it on ahead. A thought. So having gone through all of this, what's your action plan? We're facing some huge, huge turbulent times forthcoming. Now those times are going to be challenging to us as stewards, but they're also going to be incredible opportunities. Because many people who are complacent today, who are deaf to things of the gospel, are suddenly going to be open to asking questions. They're looking for answers. You and I need to be prepared to respond to that opportunity because it's probably going to be, here in America, one of the biggest opportunities for the kingdom in our entire history. And what we make of it is a function of our preparation. So one of the questions I want to suggest is, what is God calling you to do? You need to discover that. That's the greatest adventure in life, is to find out what God would have you do. And in any case, what I'm going to urge you to do is to raise the bar on your personal walk. You say you're a Christian. Praise God for that. What have you done with it? What are you doing with it now? Find out what God is calling you to do, and then raise the bar a notch. God is not finished with any of us, me included. All of us need, me included, need to be raised the bar on our personal walk. Every one of us has things we can add to what we're doing a little better, a little more thoroughly, a little more sincerely, with a little more depth, whatever. Whether it's studying or whatever. Raise the bar on whatever that means to you. Now, how do you do that? Well, no, whatever else it will include, I can guarantee you it'll include this, and that is a systematic study of the Word of God. And you say, well, I read it every day. Praise God, that's devotional reading. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about serious study, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book. Undertake a serious study of the Scripture. Start wherever you like, wherever you lead you to. But get into it seriously. A systematic program to study your Bible. Let that be a lifetime commitment. The other thing you might do is join a small study group. As I say, that's where I've seen people grow, in small groups. The other thing I'm going to encourage you to do is exploit all the new resources available. You can get daily updates devotionally on your iPod. You can, with a few keystrokes, find out anything on the internet. There is computer software today that will make you more effective than most pastors have been in previous decades, because you can get at any passage in the scripture immediately. You can put your cursor there and it'll tell you what the Greek or Hebrew behind that word really said. And some of these packages are free, cost you nothing. Others are quite elaborate, and you can spend a few $100s if you so choose. But the resources you have available today are astonishing. I travel on an airplane with my laptop, and I have direct word searchable access to more volumes than occupy most libraries. And it's with me as a casual appliance. But there's other resources available that I specifically like to call your attention to. But in any case, I want you to respond to that calling now. Don't put it off. Time is curious. But there's a unique resource that I'd like to close on. There is now finally, to the best of my knowledge, the only one that I'm aware of, a voluntary think tank that you can be part of it. It's designed to serve the interests of those Christians who are really serious about their personal ambassadorship of the coming King. If you're one of those, if you're serious, I want you to be aware of a think tank that you can be part of. We believe the Lord is putting new wine in new skins. Every era has a whole different style, it seems. And we're plunging into an era of internet, an era of astonishing information appliances that are casually available. It's a whole different world for learning, a whole different world for communicating. It's possible now to be part of a worldwide, a totally borderless fellowship that are not bound by any straitjackets of tradition or presumptions. And you can be part of that. How can you get involved? First of all, undertake a personal lifelong study using these resources. You can also volunteer to help us as being a teaching. Every one of our classes has a volunteer teaching. There's over 50 people there that spend their time coaching you through completion of the course you've signed up for, with maybe 12 people in your class, but a teaching assistant that does nothing there but to coach you through. We have area representatives, people who represent us in an area to respond to the needs in that area. We have research assistants that become our surveillance network. All these are volunteers. You can be one of them if you're so led. You can also, if you feel led, to sponsor special programs. Student prizes and incentives are donated for awards for people that have done unusual things. Practicums, internships. Many people are lining up to provide endowments for certain course development and other things. We like to get some of our stuff translated in other languages. All these things we have over 1,000 students in over 13 countries, and it's growing rather rapidly. So you can be part of it. It's a ground floor opportunity to be part of an international fellowship that you can be part of. So that's who we are. Look forward to seeing you at one of our meetings. God bless you.